Anyway, okay, so today what we're going to do is actually this is really significant. Um, well, I guess you can be the judge of that. Um, a lot of times, the most common thing is to say that Descartes was the first modern philosopher. Usually, when you study modern philosophy, you start with Descartes. I don't really agree with that, and the reason I don't is because we discussed Descartes, and as you know, what he does is he doubts everything to the point of doubting what he's seeing in front of him right now, that he might be possessed by some evil genius who's controlling his brain. And then in the second half of that book, he brings in a proof for the existence of God, which we also examined and found to be very weak. Um, And so my view of Descartes is what he did was, I'm going to show you atheists. I'm going to show that even if I doubt every possible thing I can possibly doubt, I can still prove completely convincingly that God exists. So no matter what you think you doubt, uh, I've got it covered, and I can prove that God exists. So in other words, he was kind of that was kind of a sleazy move. Well, I don't, sleazy isn't the right word. It's he didn't really doubt everything. He because he had an ulterior motive, which was to bring God into the back door. And so we still have God. So don't worry, everything's still reestablished. Don't fuss about it. But Hume doesn't do that. Hume doesn't bring God back in. He says, okay, that proof he is primarily responsible for for refuting all of the religious proofs of the existence of God. Although Kant does too, and so does even Aquinas does. He refutes Anselm's proof. But anyway, all these proofs, by the time Hume comes around, all these proofs have been refuted for the existence of God. And he accepts that. And the thing about Kant that's important is Kant gets what a big deal this is. Because Hume doesn't only refute the proofs for the existence of God, but he also has his guillotine, which means that we can't have the naturalistic fallacy by saying what is that we perceive around us, since it's natural, it must be right. And these things are the underpinnings of all morality up until the point of Hume. So, for instance, okay, what I usually do, this is my own interpretation, but I classify all thinking that believes that there's an outside structure that we need to get in tune with in order to live rightly. Every religion believes that. And certainly Plato believed it, and so did Aristotle in a different way. Aristotle thought you could observe what the proper purpose of everything was, and you should behave accordingly, advancing the purpose and not standing in its way. And of course, Plato thought that ultimately the universe was a rational place, and the closer we could approach to understanding that rationality, the better off we'd be. But Hume throws this out, and so does Kant, interestingly enough. First of all, they throw out, let's just say they throw out the rational basis for believing that. Hume also wants to throw out faith. He just thinks, hey, like Bertrand Russell said, I can't see any benefit in believe. Somebody was arguing to him that even if these things can't be proven, can't they be beneficial? And Bertrand Russell said, I don't see any benefit in believing something that's not true. I don't see how that can be beneficial. Um, I I could comment on that, but anyway, the thing is here that Hume has pulled the rug out both from the fairly secular views of Plato and Aristotle. Well, they are secular. They're pagan views, Plato and Aristotle. He's pulled out the rug out from under them as well as pulling the rug out from all religious ideas. And I usually group all these together and I call them classical civilizations. A classical civilization is one that believes that there is an outside structure uh, that makes sense, that they need to find out and then act accordingly. Native Americans believe that. All mythologies believe that. All religions believe that. And the pagans, the Greek pagans, believe that too. And Hume has taken all of that away. That's why I think of Hume rather than Descartes as being the first modern philosopher. He's saying he calls into question all of the arguments that support all of those things. Now, Kant's position is he fully understands the import of what Hume has said, but Kant's position is, well, okay, we've limited knowledge. Now we can have faith. And we must have faith because without faith, life has no meaning. And without morals, life has no balance and justice. So, how are we going to do that? Hume and Kant approach this in different ways. Hume says, well, all we could do, because he's an empiricist, all we can do is observe people and how they act and what they approve of. And what they approve of is acts that are useful. And so uh, we're going to say that is the basis for morality. And then that's going to be picked up by Mill, who we won't talk about today. Mill and the utilitarians who want to decide what is the activity that's going to make for the best for mankind, make the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Um, So that's how Hume deals with this lack of metaphysical or religious underpinning for morality. Yeah, Doug.
Does um, does he account for the fact that people could make a mistake? You know, like for instance, people want to have a certain level of um, of electrical power, let's say, to make life convenient, but that fucks up the earth. So that's a mistake, even though we consider it a virtue that we should have an advanced civilization. I don't know if I've
Yes,
got the
no,
point.
absolutely. Kant addresses that directly. Hume doesn't. I don't think Hume doesn't spend a lot of time on this, as far as I know, on that particular issue. Uh, he's often called a skeptic, and perhaps rightly so. I don't think that he's a nihilist, though. He just is very good at perceiving the glitches in the arguments that he examines. He's very good at that. And so then what are you left with? And he doesn't do a lot on the positive side, but Kant will, and that's what we'll talk about today. Now, to your point, exactly to your point, Kant is going to be the first guy that comes along and says happiness cannot result from rationality. Or maybe it's better put that it's unlikely to, or certainly not guaranteed to produce happiness. Rationality is not guaranteed to produce happiness. And why is that? I think I can find a quote where he actually describes this. Give me a second here. Um, okay, this is from the Critique of Practical Reason. He says, the concept of happiness is not one that the human being derives from instinct, but one he forms himself from the manifold and often contradictory empirical data of experience. It is a mere idea of a state, but not of a determinate state, and therefore it cannot guide our behavior as a principle. The problem, and this second quote is from the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. The problem of determining surely and universally what would make one truly happy is completely insoluble. Happiness is an ideal not of reason, but of imagination. So Kant, uh, he doesn't think you can think your way into being happy. This is kind of contrary to what Socrates said. You know, Socrates and the Greeks thought that you should advance your ability to be rational because that was the highest part of the soul for both Aristotle and Plato, and assume Socrates. We don't have his writing on it, but the idea is that, the more rational you were, the more in touch you were with the universal laws, and the more in harmony with the universe you would be. And Hume has destroyed the connection between what we can find rationally and what will make us happy or moral. He's destroyed that connection. I think I think that's accepted today by philosophers that sorry, you can't get there from here. So Kant says, however, that I think we brought this up last time, that we must act as if there was such a thing as morality, because and we must act as if there's such a thing called God. Otherwise, life would be meaningless. That's what he says. Um, the I really think this is a watershed here between many thinkers of centuries who believed that there was some kind of order to the universe that if we would just comport ourselves properly to. The tribes do this with dancing. They try to establish their relationship with the gods and try to live in harmony with the gods and not do things that the gods would disapprove of or be made uncomfortable by. So that was, and I mean, that still is a powerful kind of message that people today may speak about God in that way, but they also will speak about Mother Nature, that we should live in such a way that we're in harmony with Mother Nature, and uh, or some society like I don't know, some civic society that has values that they want to promote, that we should all unify ourselves in harmony with. Okay, well, the two guys I mentioned last time that are going to try to come up with moral laws which are a universal and applicable without using anything metaphysical, without using um, kind of the structures of society like Aristotle had in mind, without using any of that. The two guys are Kant and Mill. And Mill, we'll talk about next time. But Kant, yeah, as you probably know, establishes something he calls the uh, categorical categorical imperative. And the categorical imperative is a rule that has to apply to any kind of system of morality. And if it doesn't, it isn't a moral system. That's what he wants, a rule that is universal. And he compares this to make it clearer. So far, it's not that clear what that might mean. He compares it to a hypothetical imperative. So if you want to achieve this result or that result, you do this. If you want to choose that, if you want to achieve that, you will do this. If you want to be a lawyer, you will go to college. If you want to be a good husband, you will be a faithful husband and whatever else. I don't know what the rules are these days. It used to be you'll be a good provider and provide a moral example and so forth, hard worker, and be faithful and supportive. Maybe that's not the rule anymore. I don't know. I don't fortunately have to find a mate in this world that we live in right now. But anyway, uh, if you want to do that, this is a hypothetical imperative. Another Kant calls this a hypothetical imperative. If you want to achieve that, you will do this. The categorical imperative, however, applies to all rules, and if your law, your rule that you're acting according to, doesn't abide by this principle, then it isn't moral. And let me just read the actual text to you. The Kant states this several different ways, and let's see, where is it? Sorry. Uh, Jesus, I had this all. Sorry about this. I had this all set up, and now I'm missing it. Anyway, I can quote it from memory, I think. Uh, oh, geez, there it is. Okay, this is from groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. This is one of the several times that he mentions this principle, and this is the most standard version of it. And here's what it is: act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, this is very similar to the golden rule, but it's important to point out the difference, which Kant himself acknowledges. This is a logical test that you apply to a moral principle, and it's not an emotional one. In other words, you're not saying personally, well, I like to be treated this way, so that other person ought to be treated this way, or I'm going to treat them as I like to be treated. The reason that doesn't work as a moral principle is suppose I like to be abused. Suppose that's what turns me on. So I'm going to abuse this other person because I know that's going to make them feel right. Uh, that might be an extreme case, but the point is you can't just go on what your own personal druthers are. That wouldn't be a very good moral rule. What you have to do is examine the logic of what you're asking somebody to do. So the examples I usually use are the two examples I use are running a red light. And it's important to notice that Kant doesn't want to emphasize the outcome. He wants to emphasize the principle. So let's say I'm in a hurry and the light's red, but there's nobody coming. I just run it. And so the rule is that rule would be uh, always stop at a red light unless you're in a hurry. And so Kant says, now can I will that everybody else follows that rule? And I think we'd want to say, well, that kind of makes a red light not a red light anymore. It makes it, you just come up the intersection, see if anybody's coming, and you go. If not, and so what Kant wants to say is that that interpretation of that red light law makes the red light law meaningless. It makes it evaporate. It's not a red light law anymore. So it doesn't really conform to his principle. I can't will that everybody else follow my version of the law, which is that if you're in a hurry, you can ignore that. The thing is that what you want to avoid is making yourself an exception, you and your druthers, or you and your people, your friends and your family. The way that he writes the categorical imperative, it avoids you allowing to make yourself special, to make exceptions for yourself. And a long time ago, I decided I would never jaywalk again, just for this reason. I'm going to abide by the categorical imperative because now I'm not going to say never. There are some streets which don't have crosswalks, for a mile or two, and I'm not gonna say I'm ridiculous, but I'm not going to cross against a red light, even if there's nobody coming. It's some kind of a yoga thing or a spiritual thing. I'm not going to violate the categorical imperative by and that might seem ridiculous to you, but Kant is trying to establish something that is a rational way to live. And rationality will, again, bring you happiness. This isn't going to make you happy, but it is going to achieve a level of rationality that, if there is any happiness to be found in rationality, it would be found in satisfying the categorical imperative. But he doesn't think that would be make it a reason to live. Now, another example I use is cheating on a test. Suppose you're sitting in an exam and you don't aren't doing very well. You decide to look at your neighbor's paper, so you cheat on the test. Can I will that everybody else cheats on the test? Well, the thing is that then the test becomes a test of cheating and not of the material. It's just whoever can cheat the best will have the best grade, and whoever doesn't cheat is screwed. That's kind of what's being tested now. So it makes the test itself meaningless, or it makes it a test of something else rather than your mastery of the material. So those are just two examples I use of what the categorical imperative would mean when applied in the real world. Now, Kant does. We are going to discuss mill, and of course, mill is greatest happiness for greatest number. The problem, oh, let's review the deontological versus teleological. Deontological is Kant. Kant is the guy for deontological ethics. And of course, all religions are deontological because they say this is the rule, forget about whether it's going to achieve anything good or not. You don't have 10 commandments that have to do with the welfare state or unemployment. You have these are the rules from God. That's what you do. That's deontological. Teleological again is expecting a good result. And so the reason Kant says that that won't do as a moral principle is that you're not omniscient. You can't see what's going to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Nobody knows this. And let's see what Kant says. If I can, yeah, I was struggling finding the right passage, but let's see if I can do it again. Struggle, that is, with the right passage. Well, anyway, he says it's beyond the capacity of reason to know what is going to achieve happiness for anyone, even yourself, much less for society in general. That's just you don't know what's going to make you happy. You ever had this happen that you achieve something that you thought you'd be thrilled by and it happens and it's just like nothing? I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but uh, it can. I know it can happen. That yes, Doug.
An example that I could say was in way out in Rajasthan. There was it had been very dry, and in the distance, people could see this rain coming toward them, and they were really happy. And this one person said, "Well, how do you know this is going to make you happy? You know, this might not." And the rain came, and it was such a downpour, such a violent downpour that it actually started to wash away the walls of the buildings because they're all adobe, and it just created havoc, and so didn't make them happy.
Right, and you can't. I mean, people get married thinking that's gonna make them happy, and sometimes that doesn't work out that way. Same with children, or I mean, I'm sure you all know more about this than I do, but uh, you can't know enough. This is Kant's criticism, not mine. You can't know enough about the future to know what is actually going to make you happy. You can't, the unintended consequences. This happens with laws. It happens with lots of things in life that you think this is going to be great, and then when you do it, it's just a big pain. Yeah, Barry.
I would even argue that some of the most gratifying things are the things you don't expect to make you happy that turn out to, because you didn't the expectation of happiness sometimes dilutes the real impact of that unexpected thing that just brings you tremendous joy.
Absolutely. And sometimes if we go back to Plato, Plato his criticism of pleasure is that the greatest pleasures are often associated with the greatest pains. So if you were just starving to death, that first food would feel really good. And so um,
Pardon me?
in order to have the greatest happiness, you'd have to continually subject yourself to complete deprivation if you really wanted to be happy all the time. Uh, so anyway, this is Kant's criticism of teleological ethics is that we don't know enough as human beings to know what will make us happy, and we certainly don't know enough to know what will make other people happy. And when we get to Mill, what turns out to be the case with teleological ethics is we use teleological ethics for public policy. What we don't use it as the way Mill says, what we use it for is the greatest. Um, what we want is the greatest relief from misery for the greatest number of people. So it's a negative thing. It isn't what's going to make them happy. It's what's going to make them the most people least unhappy. That's how it's used. And so it's more like that than it is. Uh, I don't know what's going to make everybody happy. And Kant was right about this. I don't know what's going to make myself happy. I don't know what's going to make everybody else happy. But I do know that dying and having disease and crime and war, I know that's going to make people unhappy. That's easy. So let's try to avoid that. So that's the way it's actually implemented today. The greatest
We have to
happiness for the
define
greatest number.
happiness.
What's that, Doug?
Do you need to define happiness?
Well, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Uh, that's the problem. Kant said you couldn't do that.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's why he says you're better off if you're going to use your rationality for anything, you're better off using it for something that it can be applied to, not happiness. And what he says it can be applied to is a principle of behavior, and that principle is the categorical imperative. And he thinks that makes a logical sense. That I mean, I find myself applying that. Am I asking for special consideration of myself right now? Am I asking a privilege to have a privilege that other people don't have? That is what Kant is what Kant's principle is indicative of. I I didn't join a fraternity in college, and it was kind of for that reason. I don't think I'd read Kant yet, but I just thought, well, if I join an exclusive fraternity, I'm going to be a member of a club that excludes other people from having the same privileges. And I wasn't comfortable with that. I mean, maybe that's being too prissy and judgmental, but that's the way I felt. Uh, that's the way I felt about it in college.
You were preventing people from playing softball?
Well, whatever the exclusive parties were that frats
What about
had,
but
that non-frat members weren't invited to, I didn't want to exclude anybody from my party. That's the way I felt about it.
It's just going to bring up the idea of deferred gratification. That how does that fit into all this? I mean, we there's something that we kind of know will give us pleasure, but we also know that by deferring that gratification, we may achieve some higher level of fulfillment. So how do you include that in a moral scheme?
Well, that's a good question. We're going to come to that next with Bentham. Bentham has a hedonic
I don't see
calculus
what to do with this.
where you have a list of considerations.
It's in your
One of them
solution.
is that. One of them is uh, how immediate the pleasure is, how intense it is,
Yeah, but it may not
what
be
is
in
the
self-interest.
likelihood of you achieving it. In other words, you could try very hard to do something for a long period of time and still your chances wouldn't be good. Uh, is it fertile? That's another one. In other words, will it lead to other pleasures? We'll go over that. That's Bentham has this hedonic calculus, though. That's what he thinks you can do. I would still say with Bentham, you can't calculate it, though. You just don't know. You don't know how intense the pleasure will be, You don't know how much misery you'll have to go through to get there. You don't know any of this stuff in advance.
Right. So,
You just
so
can
you have
guess
to
at
just
it. That's
muddle
all you
through
can
it.
do.
Dude.
Doug to everyone. Oh, Doug, mute your mic, Bill. That's what he said.
Oh.
Um, okay, so Kant, this categorical comparative is used mostly. I said a minute ago that we use the greatest happiness principle for legislation. The government, when it makes determinations on policy, it tries to avoid bad things. But Kant's a categorical imperative, and I mentioned this before, and too bad we don't have. Let's see, who's a lawyer here? Bill's a lawyer. Are you a lawyer, Otis? No. Neil's not here. Meredith's not here. We need some more lawyers to weigh in on this. But I think I mentioned this before. The categorical imperative is a fundamental principle of legal justice in the United States. And the idea is that the rules of law will be applied the same way, no matter whether I mean, this is the ideal. I'm not saying it happens. I'm saying this is the ideal. And the rules and procedures of a law court are specifically designed to weed out considerations that don't have anything to do with the actual facts of the crime. And so you're not allowed to consider, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong here. McAdee's not here either. You're not allowed to consider something somebody said about somebody in the seventh grade. There are rules of relevance or rules of evidence. This is not admissible. This doesn't pertain to this specific thing. And so the whole point is to try to rule out consideration of anything that would prejudice the case and concentrate only on the facts that apply, that where the law applies specifically. And that way, the ideal is that everybody is treated exactly the same way in court. Is that right, Bill? I can only ask you because you're the only lawyer here. So that's correct. So that's the categorical imperative. We don't the law the rules of evidence aren't based on what's going to make the most people happy. If they were, we'd just take the crowd would just go out and get the guy and hang him, right? We'd just have a lynch mob. That would be what would make the most people happy. But that's not what we do in the rules of law. We use the principle of the categorical imperative. And yes, Barry.
So Tony, so you said earlier that Kant believes we still need to have faith that still has a role in this morality question. So my question to you is, where does Kant get his principles of morality, if not through, I mean, all these things that are not uh, legitimate sources of moral, decisions. Where does he get his moral code from?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I think what he would say is this is what rationality is for. This is what human rationality is for. And remember, he speaks highly of the golden rule, but he says it's not clear enough because the golden rule allows you to make personal judgments on how you'd want to be treated that aren't necessarily universal. That not, you're being naive about what is going to satisfy the other person because you're basing it on your own background and prejudices and experiences rather than a rational one. So Kant, again, I think I said that Kant doesn't think you can prove that somebody should be moral. He doesn't, and Mill will admit this too. You can't prove that morality is how you should behave. All Kant says is if you're going to have moral rules, they must all satisfy at least this principle, the categorical imperative. Otherwise, you're asking for special privileges for people, and that isn't fair. So I don't know how to answer it better than that because like he admits that you can't prove that you need that would be morality is in the noumena, if you remember that term. Morality is not one of the facts of life that we can determine by observing, but we can, if we want to be moral, we can apply this logical rule. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean,
Yeah, I'm looking for an example of a moral rule that Kant would uh, support.
well, what, give me an example of
Well,
one he
if
wouldn't support.
the golden rule is not comprehensive enough, because that strikes me as a pretty close approximation of a pretty pretty good universal moral principle. What does he have any moral principles that satisfy his criteria?
Well, I think you should ask again, W.T. Jones has a great example. He says, just because it satisfies Kant doesn't mean it's moral or it should be a moral law. And he uses the example of signing your name in every book you buy. Can I will that everybody should do that? I guess that doesn't violate the categorical imperative. However, it hardly rises to the point of being a moral law. Well, I mean, it'd be more like stuff like murder. What you do is you take our normal moral laws, like don't lie, don't murder, don't cheat on your wife, uh, don't torture animals. You would take actually, I don't think Kant considers animals, but Mill does. Anyway, you just ask yourself, does this moral law that I'm behaving according to right now, does it abide or satisfy the categorical imperative? Yeah, Doug.
So back to your crossing the street thing.
Okay.
What if what if you're saying jaywalk absolute is sort of an absolute law, no jaywalking. Okay. So what if you said you can only cross the street if it's safe to cross the street?
Yeah, that's a good way to get around the categorical imperative is just as you say, Doug, that's very clever. What you do is you rephrase the law or the rule so that you can say, well, everybody can do that. And then are you not thrown back on the idea of kind of an empirical judgment of what is safe and what isn't safe? But I think I could answer that since you couldn't predict in every situation whether the person's judgment about what is safe and what isn't safe is a fair judgment, then it couldn't be applied universally. Because one person might have a very good idea of whether they can make it before that car hits them, and the next person might not have a very good way of judging. So I don't think you could want to apply it universally. It wouldn't make sense. Remember, we don't want to say, okay, well, that would result in more deaths, because that would be considering the deontological side of the question. The question is whether it could make sense. And I guess I would have to say that just like same thing at the red light. At the red light, if I say you can violate that when it's safe to do so, but can we establish that every person's understanding of the word safe is the same and they're equally uh, capable of making that judgment? But what you're saying is a very good criticism of the categorical imperative that sometimes you can get around it by kind of redefining like don't kill it and don't commit murder unless the person deserves it. Does that satisfy the categorical imperative? Well, who's good?
Self-defense, only self-defense, whatever that is. Yeah.
Well, and that's a good point too, because our law does allow for that. It
Mhm.
says, well, there are cases where murder is justified because, and that's another universal law. Can you make that universal? Well, then you have to determine whether it was in fact self-defense or not. Yeah, Bill.
So, wouldn't the hearsay rule bring all this up that, there's, you can't admit hearsay, but then there's all these exceptions to the hearsay rule that allow you to admit hearsay in certain cases.
Give me an example.
Dying declaration. Someone's about to die and they say something in the course of dying. That can be admitted as an exception to the hearsay rule. So why do we have to have, I guess what I'm asking is how narrow is the categorical imperative have to be to even be useful?
Bill, don't bother me with actual practicalities in real world situations. We're philosophers here. We don't taught we don't tarnish ourselves with actual reality. No. To answer your question, the law, I mean, that's what we have courts for. Like, and in that situation, I imagine that I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but I imagine what would have to be uh, adjudicated is, I mean, things that would be relevant were, okay, the guy on his deathbed said, I'm changing my will, you get everything. Okay, does the person that heard that message benefit from the statement or not? Were there other witnesses? And so I guess that the rules of the court or rules of evidence would still pertain. You'd want something that established that could a reasonable person believe you?
I'm just pointing out that the rules of evidence have all kind of contradictions built into them.
Exceptions, I would say, not contradictions. They have
Okay.
exceptions, and that would be in the categorical imperative. But it still is a good. I think it is a good ideal for the courts to have that every situation like that, like what you're saying, would be adjudicated. But that's why you have to have people in a jury decide, okay, does that meet that standard of being something that uh I mean, I don't know, Bill. I guess you consult precedents at that point. I don't know whether it's written into the law that a dying statement that I don't know if that's part of the
Yes,
law.
I'm representing to you that it is.
Oh, it is
There
part
are
of the law. Okay.
declarations that are considered an exception to the hearsay rule. Just like there's all kind of exceptions to all kind of rules of evidence. It's a big muddle, and that that's what makes good lawyers sometimes is the guys can do that on their feet and figure it out and blah 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 blah. I just wonder about how beneficial it is to have um, to how far does the categorical imperative get you?
Well,
You know,
I think it's the overriding principle. I think that in every situation, that's why you have a court to determine whether
yes.
the rule has been satisfied or not. So I imagine like the case I just gave you where the guy himself, the guy that's a witness to the last statement, himself stands to personally benefit from that statement having been said, and he's the only witness to it. Wouldn't that be brought up in court?
Sure.
Right. So the idea is that even that exception has to be adjudicated by reasonable people. They have to say, well, okay, do we believe you or not? And then they have to determine, and I guess that's the case with every witness. Do we believe him or not?
Well, yeah, but you have a judge that makes the ruling, and then the jury decides what that evidence establishes. That's the ideal.
Right,
We're
but it's not random. There is an ideal it's trying to be abided by,
correct.
an overriding ideal. That doesn't mean in every situation it's real obvious what to do. Same with the greatest happiness for greatest number. Uh, if there's four of us, we can probably decide that amongst ourselves. But if we're trying to decide for 10 million people, it might not be so easy to decide what's going to make most of them happy.
So Tony, I will offer
Oh, there's Anne has appeared.
a practical consideration for this is medical ethics. So we actually have, if you want to do a study that involves human subjects or actually even animal subjects, it has to be approved by an institutional review board, which actually includes an ethicist. And I had to take courses in medical ethics. And there are essentially categorical imperative type questions that come up in deciding whether a study is ethical. And I don't know that we explicitly say, how does this fit the categorical imperative?
Probably not.
But probably not. But the people who sit, there are people, ethicists who sit on these boards, who I would assume have been, trained in philosophy and ethics as well. These are not sometimes they're religious people, but mostly they're people with some sort of medical ethics official training. And I assume that includes philosophy courses. I was wondering and thought, gee, I should look up what our medical ethicist background is. But the questions can be very complex, and trying to figure out whether the rules that we try to apply that should apply fairly to everyone apply in this case. There are issues, for example, if you are going to include children or people with dementia, how do you do that in a way that doesn't violate their rights in a way that you wouldn't, that essentially wouldn't, that you want to apply these rules for inclusion or exclusion, or what treatments you can do, or fairness, or principles of justice. Can you make those universal, and how do you deal with, as you say, the exceptions? And a lot of that people have tried to codify.
First of all, I'd be very, very shocked if somebody who is presenting themselves as an ethicist was not familiar with Kant. I mean, this is
I'm sure.
Kant and Mill are just like ethics 101. So, of course, they would be familiar with it. But something that also is relevant to your that concern there is that it's just recently that people have realized that, oh, if our study only included white people, maybe it's not relevant to people, or as relevant to people who aren't white, or even more, I think importantly, what if it was only men that were involved in this study, and so does it still apply to women? That would be more of a scientific question. But still, it involves the idea. Okay, this rule, does it apply to everyone, or does it just apply to this group?
Yeah, and that's the kind of questions we deal with. And right now, I'm on a study section reviewing grants about low and middle income countries, and trying to study dementia issues in those countries, and trying to figure out. And I personally don't think they're going to fund any of these, because the current administration doesn't give a rat's patootie about that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have canceled HEPFAR. But what do I know? The best thing George W. Bush ever did in his whole life was to save millions and millions of lives of people with HIV. That program has been canceled. And
George Bush is looking better and better, isn't he?
Well, I wouldn't say he's looking better and better, but
Yes.
he's no longer the worst president ever, if he was.
By that, yeah, by a long shot.
Certainly not the worst ex-president. At any rate, I look at these, and Mark Yarbrough, who I know is our current emeritus, or maybe he's emeritus now, but just kind of distinguished ethics professor, and it's fascinating to be in these conversations, and to see how someone who has, as you say, probably been trained in Kant, et cetera, carries on a conversation about medical ethics when you have a very complicated situation. And how do you approach that? So I'm anyway, this conversation about the categorical imperative is really interesting to me, as someone who deals with touchy questions in especially things like dementia, HIV, the trials that I have worked in, and
It occurs to me,
life issues.
Laurel, that the principle, the categorical imperative, is kind of a central principle in doing any kind of study because if you have a bunch of variables, which ones are accidental, which ones are essential? In other words, which ones are really pertinent to the study or not? And if you have a bunch of wild variables that then you're not treating everybody equal. Everybody isn't getting the same test, as it were, because we're not eliminating, say, people who, whatever, over the age of 50 or under the age of 5 or something, whatever it takes to make the study meaningful, it means that you have to apply the same procedure and the same and eliminate the same variables in every case.
So I'll give you a really concrete example, just one rule that we now have. In reviewing grants, we no longer can consider as part of the team's ability to carry out the work. Oh, this team, they didn't actually say it in the grant, but they've done all this stuff. And so, they're at Harvard, so we know we can do it. So the review now is explicitly told you have to focus on what's presented to you, and you're not supposed to treat Professor or Dr. X specially because they're, at Harvard. And so they're trying. They're trying.
Yeah, Barry.
Yeah, you just, in the area of medical ethics, it seems to me that the principle of do no harm, which is kind of an overriding medical ethical principle, is also subject to all kinds of interpretations and debates. I mean, for example, in double-blind studies where you do a placebo for one group and the supposedly effective cure for the other group, are you depriving the group that got the placebo from being cured? There's ethical issues there. So, I mean, it seems like any of these principles, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie, all have lots of qualifying conversations to be had to truly get to the principle itself.
And sometimes the principles of greatest happiness for the greatest number, or do the least harm, as the way you were putting it, conflicts with the rule. In other words, you might have to. Maybe the best result, I'm going to say, maybe I can use eugenics here. Maybe the best result for science is if we could just experiment on human beings. Maybe we would get better results faster if we could just do radical experiments, on human beings, and that would definitely violate the categorical imperative. But the outcome might be, in the end, more beneficial to more people. Like you might benefit millions of people by, accidentally killing a couple of hundred, right, in your study. Uh, so yeah, sometimes the principles will come into conflict with one another. I mean, that was an overdramatic way of saying it, but I'm sure that Laurel could point us to ones that aren't quite so dramatic, but still important.
Uh, Tony, we go through a lot of ethics training that points and uses examples of studies precisely that for that as that violate things in precisely that way. Studies that were done with, for example, the syphilis studies that left people untreated so that they could observe what happened. And there are principles of justice and equity that we are supposed to consider. And if there's an accepted treatment, you don't use placebos if that would violate. I mean, there's a whole lot of equity issues, justice issues, um, issues of full informed consent. That's a tricky one. What do you do with informed consent when people have dementia or when you're working with children? There's a lot of interesting stuff. But anyway, I have to go through ethics training every year.
So I guess Doug was first and then Deborah.
So I have a friend who was the bioethicist at Yale Med School. She was a Yale Law School grad, and she was fired, squeezed out because a study that a fairly well-known professor was doing, uh, probably an off-label use of a drug, but was doing the study in Africa. you know. And she said, it's not ethical. You're using it on people who are not, you know, not sophisticated enough to know that this is whatever the problem. It may have actually been beneficial to them, but they would never have gotten away doing this study in
in the
this
United
country.
States.
Yeah, she got fired. He was too powerful. So
Deborah,
ethics,
He
oh,
produced more
sorry.
income for the school.
yeah.
So Deborah, you had something?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can formulate this exactly. This question is a little bit of
I
a
know
change
that
of
feeling.
topic. But when you were talking about your jaywalking example, yeah, uh, I was thinking, okay, well, what if I just painted a nice crosswalk on my back patio? And whenever I freaking felt like jaywalking, I would just go out to my own little crosswalk and jump across it, F you. And then I started thinking, well, what about, serious issues? Like, I mean, Kant says, in a way, the golden rule, yes, you should treat other people, including yourself, to the best communal good. What about suicide? Do I have, according to Kant, the right to take my own life? I'm alone, I'm old, I'm 80, all my friends are gone. What's wrong with that?
It seems to me that rings a bell. I'm not sure. I'll have to look it up whether Kant actually addressed suicide as one. And just Deborah, he doesn't care about the outcome that makes everybody happy. That's not Kant's.
Okay.
That's not his orientation. His orientation is the rule, and if you are worrying about outcomes, you're going to be engaging in something that you don't have the enough knowledge to determine. Now, look, these principles are ideals, and I think Bill was pointing this out that you can't go through your life. You don't know what whether anything's going to make you happy or not. You don't know if you're going to have a cup of cocoa in 5 minutes. Maybe it's going to make you feel bad. You don't know what the outcome of anything is. So uh, Kant is saying uh, if you had to act purely on the basis of the categorical imperative and everything had to be rational, that was the mistake of Ayn Rand. Oh my God, what an
Yeah,
idiot.
I was thinking
But
of.
the idea that you'd be doing everything rationally is not realistic. However, what he's trying to do is say this is a fundamental bar, and below this bar, if it doesn't satisfy the categorical imperative, you have to question its morality. And above it, then there's probably still other questions with regard to Mill, with regard to greatest happiness kinds of things. And so I think Laurel was saying that she has both issues, that both issues are involved in determining medical ethics. I just have to say this one thing. Many years ago, there were three kids from the Stanford School of Business on the William F. Buckley show, Firing Line. And it was so bizarre. They said, he said, well, what are you studying? And he said, one of the kids said, do you believe we have to take classes on ethics? It's outrageous. And Buckley was agreeing, yeah, why would business students have to take classes on ethics? That's ridiculous. I never forgotten that. The idea that they say that in public, that we don't have to know about anything about doing the right thing. How ridiculous. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted the flow. Anybody got more stuff?
I guess my question, am I still muted or unmuted?
No, we hear you.
My question really was like Christianity is very anti-suicide. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it makes that point. And I don't understand, I guess, where I guess since I'm just one of humanity and I'm one of 1,000 or 1,000,000, then the categorical imperative applies to my personal behavior when it affects no others.
I think the only way you can apply the categorical imperative there is that if the law should be universal. If it's okay for you to do it, then it's okay for me to do it. And certainly there'd be no, the categorical imperative would include no religious sense that it was sinful or anything. It's just whether
Mhm.
you and the next guy are being, excuse me, treated the same way by the law. It's a good question. Peter,
I missed most of the class, unfortunately, so I don't know if this kind of question came up. But one thing I've been doing is rereading an essay by Max Weber called Politics as a Vocation, where he makes this famous distinction between an ethic of responsibility and an ethic of absolute ends. And the example he gives of the ethic of absolute ends is the Christian does right and leaves the results with God. And what he says is that in politics, if you follow an ethics of absolute ends, you will pay very little attention to the consequences of your actions. And so it can go around in a circle. The one who believes in an ethic of absolute ends, and I think this would be particularly true of a utilitarian, can say, well, if it ensures the happiness of 1 million people, there's nothing wrong with killing 100 people, and so on. So Weber points out that the ethic of absolute ends can be dangerous, and he's in general in favor of the ethic of responsibility. He says if you're in politics, you need passion, a sense of responsibility, and a sense of proportion. So the politician has to say not just is this right or is this true, but what are the likely consequences of saying it or doing it? Um, but then he kind of goes back a little bit and he says, generally speaking, in politics, you have to follow the ethic of responsibility. Otherwise, you won't really be a responsible or useful politician. But at some point, if even a politician who is used to manipulating things and considering consequences rather than absolute ends or absolute truth, if he doesn't have a point where he says, no, I will not do this, or yes, I must do this, then he's empty and he stands for nothing. So Weber ends up saying there is something to both kinds of ethic, but the balance between them is very tricky. And as I said, this is a little off the subject, but I think it does at least resonate with utilitarian ethics and Kantian ethics.
well, I'm reminded of the uh, bit of a controversy we had with the Euthyphro, where there were people that said that we can't arrive
Mhm.
at a perfect black and white rule. And but that itself is saying a statement that you mean to be true.
Right.
So you kind of already violated your own principle. Uh, in a way, I'd be willing to say that society has a way of figuring these things out that is more or less as good as the philosophers do. And the problem with the rules that Bill, as Bill pointed out, is that if you have this absolute rule, uh, there's going to be you're going to have to finesse it in very many situations. The rule won't be clearly applicable, and certainly I the point I made with utilitarianism with regard to Augustine was, yeah, okay, this is the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and therefore ipso facto it's sinful. Because if the greatest number are happy, they're happy because they're evil and they're getting their the evil desires fulfilled. So therefore, the greatest happiness for greatest number is the worst of all possible outcomes. And so you could say that if you're Augustine. So that's to your point, Peter, that in the end, you still have to have some kind of principle. All these guys are trying to do, bless their hearts. I mean, they're doing their best to try to uh, figure out, okay, what is this rule that we all know we want to abide by? We want to be right. We want to be just. and what is the rule that tells us whether we're being just or not. And I think, well, these are all I can say is these are two of the biggest ones, utilitarianism. Peter, we're going to cover that next time. We really didn't cover it this time. We started with Kant today. Yeah, Doug.
Um, Throughout my lengthy but not particularly interesting life, I my experience is that people who live by absolutes always get themselves into trouble.
Yeah.
That flexibility is absolutely required to actually be able to get through life in some reasonable and rational and considerate way, thoughtful and considerate way.
That's what's getting the country in trouble right now. The people on the right have a very simplified view of what government does and what society does, and they're just going in there with your rigid, simplified, okay, government's bad, just destroy it. And I've tried it's by the way, Doug, it's very hard. We're going to get into this issue with Hegel. It's very hard to bust yourself out of your comfort zone, and the inertia of life is very the life you live is very palpable. So it's hard to just step away from that, like the existentialists. Well, we'll be talking about this, but in any case, yeah.
A couple of examples of Kant's inflexibility. You can tell me if they're true. I didn't get them from reading Kant, but from a government course I took a long time ago with Michael Walzer. One is that Kant says you're in a city that is about to be destroyed and there is a convicted murderer. Do you hang the murderer even though the whole city is about to be doomed? And his answer is yes, because the city has to get rid of blood guilt. And the second example seems to me even more fantastic, but thoroughly consistent. Part of Kant's ethic is you never lie. And I think he was unusually, cared a great deal about getting at the truth and telling the truth. But if a man has taken refuge in your house from another man who wants to murder him, the would-be murderer comes to the door and says, "Is X in your house?" You have to say yes. Although Kant adds you can try to dissuade the murderer. So
I
that's
don't
a case I think almost everybody would say, no, you should lie.
I
Uh,
don't think those are directly from Kant. I think they're
may
from
not
people.
be,
I
as I
think
said.
they're from people who, because this has been discussed forever and ever. That the second one you mentioned, uh, like you borrow somebody's axe, and then a couple of days later he comes by. He says, "Hey, I need my axe back because my wife is driving me crazy. I'm just going to cut her head off."
Yeah.
And you owe this guy. It's not your axe. he he lent it to you. Don't aren't you obliged to give it back? That kind of thing. Yeah, I don't think Kant said that directly, but I can't see Kant being so unreasonable that he would abide by his. But there is I could give you other examples like that,
Well,
and but
actually,
all they illustrate really is that the real world is a little messier than that, and that's why we're studying these two guys, the outcome guy and the rule guy.
yeah, so Tony, the question of lying, Quakers have telling the truth is sort of an absolute principle, but during the Underground Railroad, um, if they were hiding
There you
escaped
go.
slaves, question, but they developed all sorts of like ways to get around the lying thing. They would have, is this, no, there is no one under my roof because the little hiding place was just outside the roof or something. And then there's this sort of idea that, well, okay, you lie, but at some point then you owe, when it is safe, perhaps an apology to the person you lied to, that you have incurred a debt to that person because you weighed who you're going to treat badly, the person whose life you spare or the person you lie to. Again, as you say, life is messy, but how do you
Well,
And
this
I
is
mean, we have that right now, because if things come down to the point where you wind up protecting someone from the current Gestapo, the ICE people, do you lie to them?
Yes.
yeah, but what you're illustrating is a difficulty in having rules. That doesn't mean the or applying rules, I should say. That doesn't mean the instinct to want to have rules is wrong. And that's what these guys, they're trying to say, well, what are they then? Deborah, you had something to say a long time ago. You still, I'm not, hello, Deborah. Unmute yourself. Unmute,
Did
yeah.
you say something to me?
I did. Well, you wanted to say something a long time ago, and we blew past you. So,
Oh, no, I looked up, I consulted AI about suicide, and
oh,
Kant's ideas about it. And he wrote about it quite a lot, actually, and I can't summarize it. But in general, he's against it because he believes in the dignity of humanity in general, and he believes that it's kind of a selfish act a little bit. But then he goes on to talk about how, if in fact killing oneself could be a duty to the community, or useful to an end, that useful in that the example that AI gave was Cato. And it says that Cato, the Roman aristocrat, killed himself to avoid capture by Caesar. And that really helped the whole community, that Cato was not captured by Caesar. So Kant says there are specific situations where it may be a useful
sounds like
principle.
Kant's
I,
making
I mean,
himself into a teleologist at that point. He's looking at the ends rather than the principle.
kind of, yeah, it
I'm
does,
not
but
familiar with that. I
uh,
didn't read a lot on suicide in my life because I've never had that temptation. Peter.
yeah.
On the subject of Cato the Younger, Dante, of course, has a place in the Inferno for suicides, and they are punished in a terrible and ingenious way, as you'd expect. But at the gates of purgatory, there is Cato the Younger, because although he killed himself, he did so because the Republican cause had been destroyed, and he had an ethical reason for doing it. And Dante, without saying this in so many words, has clearly
Right.
made an ethical exception of Cato as and recognized that, this is a man of great integrity and his suicide is not a sign of sin.
Well,
Interesting.
He's not in heaven, but he's at the gates of purgatory.
the
Hmm.
the cynics among us will say, well, what is the point then? It's just whatever you think. But
Don't argue.
my heart goes out to the philosophers who are really trying to figure it out. Oh, I think that was Otis saying goodbye. Needs to leave. Uh, I find it really touching that they really were trying to straighten it out for all of us. And even if they didn't succeed, I don't think Hobbes succeeded. I don't think Aquinas succeeded. The effort wasn't an evil one, I don't think. In most cases, the effort, maybe Machiavelli, I don't know. I have to go read The Prince again to know. Anyway, these are ideas that are around in the society right now, and I'm just amazed when people express themselves as if those guys never existed. It's not like you made up
Hmm.
this problem, dude.
Hmm.
Uh,
It strikes me that this reminds me a little bit of the discussion about pornography. It's hard to define it, but you know it when you see it. And I would say that morality or immorality, if you just take immorality, for example, it's easier to identify it when you see it than it is to define the line between morality and immorality.
well, yeah, I think that's right, and that's why Plato doesn't do it. He just says, okay, well, let's toss it around a bit, like we're doing here, continuing the Platonic dialectic tradition. Okay, everybody, that was wonderful as usual. And so on Tuesday, oh, I should say this. Once you have this threshold passed by Hume that Kant is the first to really realize, what you have is a non-monolithic idea of morality. The church had ruled over this for 1,000 years, the moral questions. And now, with Hume insisting on empiricism and Kant recognizing that if we want to talk about what we know, it has to be limited to empiricism, and he puts a limit on knowledge. With beginning with that, we have starting with Hegel and then Marx and the existentialists, people saying this is what it means. I mean, Nietzsche said it, but it's at this point that God is dead, that we have to look to ourselves to find value. After Hume and after Kant, we have to look to ourselves. And so Kant is trying to make a human principle, make up a human principle that doesn't rely on God, and same with Mill. So that's what's happening. I think it's a big threshold to pass, Kant and Hume. So I should say that. Anyway, so we'll continue with that with Mill on next Tuesday, and I see Anne didn't hang with us, Peter.
She's not well, but otherwise,
She's not doing well?
I don't think it's anything that serious, but that's why she isn't here at the moment.
And
Yeah.
is she recovering?
Yeah, she is.
Okay, good, good. Well, give her our best, and we will see everybody next Tuesday.
Bye.
I'll be in Banff, but I'll be thinking of you.
Okay. Yes, please do.
Good class. Thanks, everybody.
See you Saturday, Tony.
Bye-bye.